Welcome back from lunch. I'm Pierre Alliez from INRIA, Sophia Antipolis in France. I will chair this session with two papers on meshes and reconstruction. And the first talk is entitled Distributed Poisson Surface Reconstruction, authored by Hugues, Hoppe, and Kazhdan. And Misha will give the talk.
Good afternoon, and thank you. This is work with distributed Poisson surface reconstruction that was done in collaboration with Hugues Hoppe. It's sort of motivated, but I think what we know that we are now at the point where acquiring 3D data is pretty straightforward. Commodity scanners exist, and we can go out and get samples of a 3D world. This is not quite what we want. We don't want samples. At the end of the day, we want geometry, and so a natural question is surface reconstruction. How do you transform a disparate collection of points into a surface that's amenable to processing and whatnot? This is an important problem, and there's been a lot of work. In fact, there's been a lot of work, there's been a lot of surveys, and in fact, I think we're almost at the point where we can now have surveys of the surveys. There's been a lot of techniques, and what I will focus on is a particular subset of techniques called implicit surface reconstruction. You're given a point cloud, and rather than directly connecting the points with triangles, you go indirectly. You take the points and then you construct some sort of function defined in the ambient space, an implicit function. And then, as a subsequent step, you extract the level set surface, and that becomes your reconstructed surface. This approach has been successful in part because sort of formulating the reconstruction problem as fitting an implicit surface allows you to formulate this as a global problem where you get to use information from many points, all the points really, to reconstruct the point, the surface everywhere. This makes the method robust to noise. It allows it to complete surfaces where there's missing data. And so it makes this work well even for real-world data. With a little bit of pushing in terms of data structures and algorithms, you can even get linear time complexity with adaptive discretizations, hierarchical solvers. And that's pretty good, because now we're solving for surfaces with, millions of points. But linear isn't really good enough, right? So if we start looking at larger models, models comprised of, let's say, 1 billion points, then if things scaled linearly, we'd be talking about 15 hours of computation and 2 terabytes of RAM. So what we want to do is leverage the computing power we have available to us, distributed computing, and sort of in a simple way, what this entails would be something along the following lines. You're given a point cloud, you partition it into subsets of points, you send each point to a client on this distributed cluster, each one reconstructs its part of the surface, and then you merge those together and you get a consolidated point set, right? So this takes a fraction of the time because each processor is doing just a fraction of the work. They're working in parallel, and the memory requirements are only for maintaining that subset of points in memory. That's good if you can address two problems. One is you need to make sure that the implicit functions that the individual clients compute match, that they agree. And then subsequently, since you're going to isosurface those implicit functions, you need to get those isosurfaces to match at the interfaces, at the boundaries between the clients. They have to match seamlessly so you get a watertight surface. And what makes this hard is what makes reconstruction algorithms good. You like reconstruction algorithms to be global, to take into account information from far away, to be robust. But to make this work, you kind of have to work locally. On the subset of the points, you don't see everything. Okay, so that's what we'll look at. We'll look at how to address these two problems, getting implicit functions and then isosurfacing them so that you get a watertight mesh. And I'll really focus on the second one. I'll step through the first one a little bit quickly. Details are in the paper, but I'm assuming people don't really want a systems talk today. So what we're going to work on is a reconstruction method called Poisson surface reconstruction, where the implicit function that we're going to try and reconstruct is a function that's 1 inside of the solid and 0 outside. Okay? And the observation that sort of drives this reconstruction technique is if you look at this function on the right, this indicator function, you look at its derivatives, at its gradients, mostly they're 0. The function is piecewise constant. It's only right at the interface, right at the boundary, that the function changes abruptly. And the way it changes is in the direction of the normals. So you can think of these points that you're getting as input, oriented points, as samples of the gradients of the function that you want to solve. Okay, well, you have the samples of the gradient. The problem then is just find the function whose gradients best match. So that's sort of a quick summary of Poisson reconstruction. To make this work, a couple things need to be addressed. One is discretization. You have degrees of freedom with which you'll represent your function. How do you interpret degrees of freedom in terms of function? One way to do this, let's say your degrees of freedom are distributed over a regular grid, is to treat these as coefficients of either interpolating or approximating functions. So for example, if I use first order B-splines, I interpret these values as piecewise linear functions. I can use higher order B-splines, second order B-splines, or third order B-splines to get smoother functions that approximate the data. What's also nice about B-splines is that they have this tensor product structure. If I want to define B-splines not on a 1D grid, but on a higher dimensional grid, the value of the B-spline, or the evaluation of the B-splines, is obtained by taking the Cartesian products of functions in X and Y and Z and evaluating the product of those functions. Okay? So that's the representation of functions that's being used. You also don't want to represent things over a regular grid. The regular grid tends to have complexity higher than sort of the surface. The surface is codimension 1. So in n cubed in three-dimensional space, you're expecting n squared complexity for the surface. You don't want to have n cubed complexity for representing the functions, and so the standard approach is to use an adaptive discretization. Instead of discretizing over a regular grid, you're going to discretize over a quad tree or an octree adapted to the data. And then finally, in addition to having spatial linear complexity, you also want temporal linear complexity, and the way to do that is to use a hierarchical solver. Rather than solving it all at once, what you're going to do is you're going to get a coarse estimate of the solution at low resolutions, pass that up to the finer ones, refine that, and keep going until you get a progressively finer and finer solution. And this runs in linear time. This is sort of standard multigrid. And the reason this works well, or one of the nice things about this, and this is observed by work long before this one, is that in using multigrid, what you're doing is you're transforming this problem of solving a global system into a collection, to a hierarchy of updates that are purely local. You just need to know the information that's nearby. Now, at coarse resolutions, nearby has a large spatial extent. That's why you see all the points. But as you move finer and finer in the hierarchy, the data that you need to see, the data that you depend on to solve this problem or to perform the updates gets more and more localized spatially. And that's what we're going to leverage. We're going to leverage this hierarchical solver to build our distributed algorithm. So the idea is we'll start off, we'll have our server in our distributed system. The server is responsible for solving sort of a coarse version of the problem. So it'll create an adaptive hierarchy. It'll solve for the implicit function at that discretization, which is much too coarse than anything we care about. Once we have that, the goal is to refine. And so what we'll do is we'll take space and partition it amongst the clients. And we'll tell each client, you are responsible for this subset of space for getting the solution there. Okay, now to solve within any particular partition, again, we're doing local updates. Local updates means we need to know not just our values, but values nearby. So what we'll do is we'll pass to each of these clients not just the points directly in the partition, but just a little bit on either side. Okay? Then the clients will go and do exactly what they were doing before. They will adapt an octree to the subset of the data that they're seeing and refine the solution to get their estimate of the implicit function on their particular partition. Okay? So that'll give us the implicit function. From there, the goal is to take those implicit functions individually computed by the clients and extract the level set surface. And here what we need is we need those level set surfaces to match. They have to match identically at that interface. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into isosurfacing, starting sort of with the seminal work of Lawrence and Klein from almost 3 decades ago. What Lawrence and Klein do is they factor the problem of isosurfacing into a geometric problem, estimating isovertices, the vertices of your mesh, and estimating iso triangles, if you want. Sort of how do you connect these vertices? So let's start with the first problem. I'll start by talking on a square because things are a little bit easier. You'll see, you look at things one cell at a time. Each cell has corners. Each corner has values. And you identify those edges along which the function changes sign, because you want to extract the zero level set. So you have the top edge and the right edge over there where the function changes sign. You look at the values at the two corners of that edge, you fit a linear function, and then you find the zero crossings, and that gives you the positions of your isovertices on the boundaries of the cell. Same exact thing happens on a cube. You look at the 12 edges, if there's zero crossing, you fit a linear interpolant, you figure out where the zero crossing is, and you drop it in. Now from here, you have to connect these. And what Lorentzen and Klein proposed was this lookup table. In principle, there are 256 combinations, 256 different possibilities. Each of the 8 corners can be assigned a positive or negative sign. We'll assume that nothing is zero. And so for each one of those, you get some sort of connection. 256 was a big number in 1987. So with a combination of leveraging symmetries, both in terms of flipping negative and positive and rotational symmetry, they narrowed this down to a case, 15 different cases. And I said, okay, you figure out which of these 15 cases you're in, and that automatically tells you how to connect your vertices to get to triangulation. Now we're not so much bottlenecked by computation. We can do a little bit of computation. So this approach of Lorentzen and Klein was revisited. And the idea was, instead of sort of thinking this black box of case tables that's sort of preordained for you, what you're going to do is you're actually going to construct them on the fly. How does that work? Well, you think of this as an inductive problem where, as you move dimensions, you sort of create aspects of the geometry one-dimensional higher. So you start off with the edges, and those give you your zero-dimensional isovertices on each of the edges. You then look at the faces of the cube, the two-dimensional faces. They have isovertices on the boundaries, and you connect those. Okay, that gives you iso edges on the two-dimensional faces, one-dimensional iso edges, two-dimensional faces. And then you go to the cube, and you walk its boundary, which are the two-dimensional faces. There are iso edges, you connect them, and that gives you your isopolygons, and so on. And if you really need a triangulation, you can triangulate. That's fine, okay? Aside from sort of exposing what's going on, this makes it easier to address certain problems. So one problem that comes up, for example, and we'll see this, is isosurfacing octrees. If you have an octree, then the nodes, the leaf nodes, where the isosurface passes, do not all have to be at the same resolution. You can have fine nodes adjacent to coarse nodes. Right? The guy on the left is coarse, the guy on the right is fine. If you were to run marching cubes on each of the nodes independently, well, you're fitting different linear interpolants. You're getting different positions for the isovertices, and as a result, what's going to happen is these guys over here, this edge over here, won't match this guy over here. You'll have a crack. In the formulation of Lorentzen and Klein, this is a little bit hard to contend with, but in our case, well, we're constructing the isosurfaces inductively. So the isosurface for the cube on the left is obtained by constructing isosurfaces on the faces. The isosurface on that face over there doesn't match its neighbor, so all we're going to do is just copy them over from the finer ones. That ensures connectivity and then still sort of consistent with this inductive approach. The other small generalization of this was in 2007, Furman and al. Proposed a different way for estimating the isovertices. The idea is, if in addition to having values at the corners, you have Hermite data, you have gradient information, then what you can do is, instead of fitting a linear function, you can fit a higher ordered polynomial that interpolates not just the values, but the derivatives as well. In this case, if we just have first derivatives in this cubic polynomial, we'll do this. You solve a root finding problem, that gives you a new position of your isovertex. And so here's an example where this was applied. We had a rasterization of a brane. It was a binary rasterization, 0, 1. On the left is what you get with linear interpolation. On the right, you get cubic interpolation. Since it's binary, since it's 0, 1, you're expecting aliasing artifacts. Those are manifest as these stair-stepping artifacts you're seeing on the bottom left. Those go away as you use a higher order interpolant. And sort of what's nice, what I like about this is that you don't actually change how many vertices you are. You're just changing where on the edge that vertex is placed, and already you're getting cleaner results. How do you get the Hermite data? That depends. If you have purely discrete data, if you have just sample values, so you don't have derivatives, what do? You have a particular sample. Let's say the second one, you look at the neighbor on the left, the neighbor on the right, you look at how it changes, and that gives you a derivative. And the same thing for the other guy. That gives you Hermite data. You can estimate Hermite data, and that gives you your polynomial, allows you to fit a cubic polynomial. In our context, it's actually a little bit easier. We have a function that's the sum of B-splines, so the sum of, let's say, differentiable functions, so you just take the sum of their derivatives. Okay, so that's sort of the setup. And again, our goal is we have our clients who've computed these functions, and we want to extract the level sets such that they match on the boundaries. And what we saw is, one, that this is sort of done inductively, and two, this requires Hermite data at the corners. Right? So what this means for us is that we need to do the isosurfing in such a way that the two clients that share a boundary see identical Hermite data on that boundary. Okay. Well, how do we do that? So again, we have this expression of our implicit function as a linear combination of B-splines. So you have the B-splines and their coefficients over there, and we're going to restrict it to the boundary. We'll restrict it to z equals z naught. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that third function, which is a function of z, we just lock its value at z naught. And the first two are still variables. Okay? And what this is nothing more than an expression of a function in terms of a 2D B-spline basis where the coefficients are readily available. You just take the sum of the old coefficients weighted by the 1D B-spline evaluated at z naught. Okay? Good. So again, we want these to match. We want the restricted B-spline coefficients to agree. Right? If the restricted B-spline coefficients agree, the functions have the same value and the same derivatives. So then this is just straightforward. The two clients will compute their restricted B-splines from either side. We'll average them. That's it. We get something that agrees. Now we have the B-spline coefficient, the average one. We can compute the Hermite data associated with that. We can pass that on to the clients. So here's the value at your corners. Here's the derivatives. And actually, in addition to this, what we'll do is, since we already have this 2D construct in our isosurfacing, we do it inductively. So we do the sides of the cubes first. We can actually extract the subset of the surface on that 2D plane. We can extract the iso edges from this Hermite data and pass that to the client. And what's nice about this is now we're guaranteeing seamlessness because they're getting exactly the same edges. We're computing it once and passing it to both sides, so they're working with the same thing. Now, what we don't quite have is, one, we needed Hermite data. We needed partial derivatives in x, y, and z. We have partial derivatives in x and y because when we restrict a 2D function, we can take its derivatives. We don't have partial derivatives in z. And the other thing we need to contend with is that we're not actually working with over a regular grid. And neither of these is particularly hard. So let's start with the first one. You want partial derivatives with respect to z. So again, you have this function that's a linear combination of B-splines. You take the partial derivative with z. The basis functions are Cartesian products, so you're just taking the partial derivative of the last function. And you're going to play exactly the same trick that you did before. This is just a function in the 2D plane expressed in terms of the B-spline basis where the coefficients are known. Now, instead of taking sum of the bijk weighted by the value of the B-spline and z0, you take weighted by the value of the derivative. Okay? That gives you the restriction of the partial derivative with respect to z on the face, and you do the same trick and you average. Okay? Good. The other problem was the fact that we're not working over a regular grid, but that turns out to be okay as well. So here we go. We have a volume. We have some implicit function. I'm just showing you a zero level set. And we have a plane that's cutting through it. We can think of this as the interface between the two sides. And on that plane, we have a function. Well, it's not hard to show. We'll show this in the paper, is that that function is itself represented over an adaptive structure, a quad tree structure that can be derived from the octree structure. So you don't have to have a fully regular representation. So you can still do things in terms of the adaptive context. That almost solves the problem, except you're not guaranteed that the quad trees that you get from the two sides are the same. Right? So if I have some sort of funny sampling, let's say the cylinder, and on the top left I sample densely, on the bottom right I sample densely, and I cut right in the middle, then from the top side, if I build up the discretization, and then it'll be sort of denser on the left side. From the bottom side, it'll be denser on the right. The two extracted quad trees will be different. We'll have different topologies. What do? Not so hard. We take the two quad trees and we merge them. We compute the smallest quad tree that contains both of these as subtrees. That requires introducing new nodes, new degrees of freedom, but we just set those B-spline coefficients to 0. Right? We don't actually want to change the function. So any new function coefficients that we have to assign, we set them to 0. Now we have a representation of the two functions over the same quad tree, and so we can average the values. So how does this work? So here's a visualization. This is the Angel data set. I think it's provided as part of the benchmark paper by Bergman et al. It's a sampling of this angel sculpture, sampled only from the front. It has no samples on the back. What you're seeing is the red lines indicate the partition boundaries, how the work was assigned to the different clients. You'll note that they're not uniformly sized. We solve a dynamic programming problem to actually try and distribute points uniformly across the clients. We think of points as being roughly representative of the amount of work each client does. We want things to be load balanced. So you're seeing that they're differently sized. And sort of the inset on the left is showing you this is what happens even in the case when there is no overlap. We said we needed overlap because we needed a little bit of locality. But what do we know? We know that this is guaranteed to be seamless. The surfaces extracted from the two sides share the same edge by construction. So that's good mathematically, but certainly the results are not, right? So these are seamless. There's no boundaries over here, but you see these little valleys that are a result of the fact that sort of the two functions from the two sides, or the restricted functions from the two sides, are quite different. And if you average, you get something that's far from both of them. And so this creates this geometric sort of distortion. But even with a little bit of overlap, this completely goes away. So the implicit so this is sort of showing that the surfaces are seamless, but you also want the implicit functions to match. And with a little overlap, you get that. You can even sort of analyze this by looking at the distance between each point on the reconstructed surface from the closest point on, say, surface reconstructed on a single core machine, right? You can take that as the ground truth. You clearly see these vertical lines corresponding to the partition boundaries, corresponding to the areas. What you also see is these blue areas. These blue areas are points on the backside of the scan where there are no samples. In that case, you're really dependent on global data to fit the surface there. That's the only thing that guides the reconstruction. And what's kind of surprising is if you look at the image on the right, despite the fact that we're only using a small amount of overlap, there are no blue regions, right? So the error is less than half a voxel at its worst anywhere. I think the worst is like a quarter voxel distance. So even just a small overlap gives you all the global information that you would need to match the single core implementation. Now what we're really interested in is bigger models. So big, we have to place Michelangelo's David horizontally. All right, so that's a billion point set, courtesy Digital Michelangelo project. This is a 2 billion point set, courtesy of Resonite. The bottom one has colors, the top one does not. If you recall, we sort of did some back of the envelope estimation of the complexity for the David, which was 1 billion points we expected, given what we were seeing before, about 15 hours of computation, about 2 terabytes of memory. The Safra square data set, which is twice as large, should require twice as much time and twice as much space. When we run this on a distributed cluster with one client and one server and 64 clients, we find that it takes about 22 minutes. 22 minutes for both of these. And the peak memory usage of any single client is around 48 gigs, which is nice. Sort of, if you do the back of the envelope calculation again, you can see that this is a reduction of roughly 45 in terms of time for the David and 50 in terms of memory. So not quite 64, but getting there. I don't actually know why Safra is doing better than predicted, better than a factor of 64, but we'll let that stand. To try and zoom in a little bit, okay, here's our David. Again, the red lines indicate the partitions assigned to the individual clients. Again, you can see that the partitions are not uniformly spaced along the axis, the x-axis in this case. Again, this is because we allocate the partitions in a way to try and load balance. And here we have the zoom-ins. Now, if you look, you will see funny spots here and here. Some are here. You'll see some funny spots there. But if you look at the inset image, you see that those aren't correlated with the red lines. They're not correlated with partition boundaries. These are just artifacts of the fact that, you know, rigid alignment was used to register the scans, and there's some misalignment. And so when you have misalignments, you have these natural errors. And you can see that this is not like speckle errors. This is like chunks errors, chunks surface patches, because these are sort of individual scans sitting on top of each other. And if you look at the Safra data set, you can see a similar thing. In this case, we're focusing on the color rather than the geometry. But again, you can see that there are no seams, no visible seams, at least at the partition boundaries. You're getting a clean reconstruction. Okay, so just to summarize, the idea was to present a distributed approach for surface reconstruction, we need to solve two problems. One is to get the implicit functions to match. One is to get the extracted level sets to match. For the former, we used hierarchy to transform a global problem into a collection of local problems. For the latter, we used restriction to a 2D plane and averaging. And that gave us a distributed algorithm that's seamless, runs in a fraction of time, roughly, reduction roughly proportional to the number of clients. And at least visually inspecting this, it seems like this is no different than what you would get from a single core solution. Let me skip this part and go directly to the questions. So we did this, right? And we did this without padding. We partitioned the points, and there were these very visible artifacts at the seam boundary. We extended this because that was sort of the natural thing to do, and these completely went away. And we don't really understand why this works so well. And so that's a question we'd like to look at a little more deeply. What's going on here? Why is it that such a small amount of overlap and suddenly the problem is so easily solved? Is this a function of the PDE that we're solving? Is it fundamentally a Poisson equation? Does it have to do with the order of the B-spline basis that we're using? My suspicion is that you could sort of get an answer by looking at the Green's function and make sure that it's sort of well represented in terms of the basis, especially near the boundaries, but I don't know. It'd be nice to understand when this type of approach would work. For example, if you use the smooth sign distance function reconstruction method, could this work as well? The other thing that sort of remains open to me, and it's remained open for a while, is sort of this inductive, dimension inductive interpretation of what's going on with Lorentz and Klein. So you start off by computing the isovertices on the edges and merging them to iso edges on the faces, and then iso polygons on the cells. You should be able to extend this to higher dimensions, but it hasn't been extended. So it'd be interesting to see what's involved in this. One thing you do have to contend with is a little bit of topological ambiguity, and this is actually manifest even in the 2D case. If you look at the case of a square, if you assign corner values that alternate in sign from plus to minus, then you get these 4 isovertices, and it's not clear which way to construct the edges. And this was, in fact, a problem for Lorentz and Klein. They got it wrong, I think, the first time, and they got these cracks in their surfaces. So you have to be careful to ensure that sort of what happens on the faces. There is ambiguity, how to make that consistent. There's other kinds of ambiguity that arise as you move to higher dimensions. For example, you get a curve, in the top one you get a curve around the boundaries of the cube. In principle, you can get 2 curves. There's no reason you have 1. Should you connect that as a single cylinder or 2 topological disks? Again, topological ambiguity, trying to understand what kind of topological ambiguities arise, and then sort of understanding that, what is the way to resolve those in a consistent way so things that remain seamless across faces that are shared. Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Misha? There are mics.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Have you tried other partitioning lines than these horizontal ones, like the geodesics between 2 customized points? Why do we go with this structure? I didn't.
Why strictly?
Yeah. Maybe from one high curvature point to another high curvature.
We're going to be solving this on a grid, right? So on a regular grid. So the natural thing is to sort of use the tensor product structure of the grid and do the decomposition on one of those axes. But in principle, you could think about partitioning across, partition the grid into cubes and sort of assign different cubes to different processors. Our goal was to try and minimize the surface area between adjacent clients. Right? The less surface area between clients, the less information needs to be communicated. So sort of straight planes along the dominant axis. So we do some estimation of what is the dominant axis. Gives us sort of the smallest amount of surface area, the smallest amount of information that needs to be communicated.
Yeah, I see. And I have a second one from your last slide, actually. In that ambiguity, don't people usually like upsample by putting something in the middle, and based on that sign they decide to...
multiple ways to resolve this. So in this particular case, the ambiguity is resolved. So that's correct. One way to do this is just forget marking cubes and use marking simplices. then everything is linear. You don't have trilinear functions. You don't have this problem with a single level set that passes through every cell. Alternatively, what you can do is you can say, okay, I have the 4 values. Let's look at their average. We're assuming that that's the value in the center of space. We know if it's positive, it should contain it. If it's negative, and that's a consistent definition. In this case, it's defined. It gets more complicated. If you think about a cube where sort of the 2 antipodal points are, let's say, negative, everything else is positive, you get 2 disks. You need to figure out if there's a path somewhere in the interior of the cube that goes from one to the other without passing through the boundary. That's a harder question. Here, you just need to sample 1 point. It's a reasonably straightforward question. But I think that, again, the topological question in that case is hard.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question? Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just had a quick question about this memory savings that you reported. Was that the memory usage per client, or does this first? Okay.
Yeah, so it's right. I mean, the total memory usage should be the sum of the memory used should be the same. Just like the sum of the time should be about the same. It's a little more because the point clouds are overlapping, so there's some redundancy in the work, but not a lot. So the sum of the time and the sum of the work should match what would happen on a single core.
Thanks.
Is there another question? Okay.
I just want to ask about these error seams. Have you tried visualizing how they extend through the SDF away from the boundary with or without overlap?
These guys?
Yeah.
So in the paper, we do. So what we do is, let's see, I have to remember what we do. You have, there are many ways to quantify the mismatch between the interfaces. Certainly the most natural one is you have two 2D functions. What is the L2 distance between those 2D functions? Right? That gives you sort of not just at the boundary. But at the end of the day, we don't care what happens away. We care about the level set. So we use this visualization because I think it was more telling in terms of what sort of an end user of the reconstruction algorithm would want. They would want to make sure that these are seamless. It doesn't really make a difference if the implicit function's values away from this point are different, because we would never see that in reconstruction.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was trying to understand why, with the adaptive grid that you, in the original paper, it makes sense to use the adaptive grid and not waste resolution in areas that are far from the points, because those areas are kind of boring, right? The vector field in those areas is constant as 0, like you said. But here, when you use the adaptive grid for each client, the parts that are being coarse are interesting parts, right? The parts with many points. So it's really hard for me to understand how it could work so well. So I guess I'm trying to know if you have an intuition of how can the results in one area be good for a global PDE when you have coarsened a whole area of the domain. Yeah, this picture. Seems incredible.
Okay, so what's the question?
The question is if you've done any numeric testing here to know if the error of the analytic PDE solution goes down with the resolution of the finer part or of the coarser part.
So again, let me be clear about what's happening. We solve the coarse part on the surface. Right? We adapt to the point in the finer. We send the whole coarse solution to each client, so it has it. Now, to construct the system, it doesn't need to see beyond, it doesn't need to see all the refinement over here to see what the linear system is on this side. It never sees that. When you're using Gauss-Seidel relaxation, you have 2 or 3 iterations of Gauss-Seidel, you see 2 or 3 neighbors. So what the solution is, the globally estimated solution beyond that, simply doesn't make a difference. You never touch that. So you can afford to be coarse away from your boundary because you just don't need those boundaries.
But it's a global PDE, right? Like you need.
The global part is solved by the Poisson.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is, does the error, because of that global part, does the error of the numeric solution go down with the refinement of the global part, or with the refinement of the deepest depth of the octree?
Deepest depth, yeah.
Okay.
Again, for Gauss-Seidel, all you need to do is refine. Let's say you're going to do 2 paths of Gauss-Seidel. You need a 2-ring extension of the system. That's all you need. You'll never see more. Whether you're doing this on a single client or multiple clients doesn't make a difference. A certain solution will be that I don't know. And that question, I think we looked at a little, didn't find that it makes much of a difference, but it is possible that if you really care about precision, you'll see something as a number of operations.
Thank you very much. So I keep an eye on the watch, and all the questions have to be kept for the coffee break. Let's thank our speaker one more time. The next talk is entitled Visual Preserving Mesh Repair, and the speaker is Hugues, who is Principal Research Scientist at Lightspeed Studios.
All right, yeah, thanks for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Kui, and I'm going to present our work titled Visual Preserving Mesh Repair, and this is joint work between Lightspeed Studio and Peking University. And the first author, Zhongtian, Zheng, cannot attend this because they're busy with the graduation, so I'm going to present his work. And yeah, so mesh has been widely used representation in a lot of applications. So as a game studio, we're particularly in the game scenes. And here is the typical game scene. We have a lot of models here represented in mesh, such as tree, building, bench, and the street light. And these things typically contain 10 to 100,000 of the triangle face for rendering purpose. And however, besides the high-resolution rendering mesh, a list of auxiliary mesh also needed to use on the runtime, such as the level detail mesh we use for the model far away from the camera, and we also need the collider for the simulation, and also the occluder if the building is blocked by other buildings before the camera. So in order to automatically generate all those auxiliary mesh, it typically requires very good mesh. So I will talk about what is good mesh in our definition, but in order to automatically generate those kind of auxiliary mesh, all the most efficient method, they have to require the mesh has good quality. And also, a good mesh can also facilitate a lot of downstream applications, such as compute the sentence field, feasibility animation, and also the keynote today this morning, and also can be used for the machine learning as well. But unfortunately, in practice, artists may correct defective mesh during during the modeling process. And for instance, when artists create a building model like this one I show here, and they most care about the parent. They don't really care about what's the geometric or topological issue of that. And which could lead to a lot of defects, such as intersection, degeneration, and a singular edge, vertex, in-content orientation, and so on. And also, even they realize that they want a good mesh that they can use for other purpose. For the complete model like this, it'll be hard for them to detect where the issue and then to fix them. And therefore, we need a robust and efficient mesh repair method can compose arbitrary input mesh into a mesh that's manifold, watertight, and minimal modification during the mesh repair. In here, we want the mesh to be manifold because we can compute the differential quality such as normal and curvature. And for the watertight, we do want a well-defined interior and exterior volume. And finally, for the mesh, we also want the mesh repair only with minimal modification, and we want to preserve all the sharp features, UV for the input mesh as much as possible, so we don't want to destroy the design from the artist. And to repair the mesh have been a topic research for more than 2 decades, and mesh repair method can be broadly classified in 2 categories. And for the local method, they usually repair the sparse defect and preserving the large portion of the visual features, but they often lack guarantee and may introduce new issues. And the global method usually solving a global optimization problem and offer greater robustness, but may violate the minimum modification requirement, and oftentimes introduce a new issue for other part. Here examples that are repaired by the previous work. As I highlight in orange here, the polymender and the volume measure may close the counter yard, which definitely not acceptable for our purpose. And while the alpha warping theory will introduce an offset to the surface, which will blur the sharp details. Okay, so because the interior structure of the building, the tag weld cannot use the wing number to correctly determine what is the right interior and exterior volume. And finally, the reason mesh repair method, they only flip the face but without guarantee to generate the watertight mesh. And in our observation is while artists may inventively create a model with defect during the modeling process, but the output model usually looks visually correct, and which can be a valuable metric for us to guide our mesh repair. So our key idea is to guide the global algorithm and use some local visual cue. And in order to use the visual metrics, we first need to define what kind of the defect phase. And in our definition, and we have three types of the issue phase. First is the invisible, and another is misoriented, and then the third is open surface. And all these types of phases we'll call the issue when we repair the mesh. We may call it we fail to detect which interior, exterior, or introduce other issues. So in order to determine which phase have the issue, and we first uniformly sample each phase. And at each sample point, and we do uniformly sample the direction and the semisphere for the positive side and negative side of the phase. And unlike the traditional retracing, and we should read from the phase, and after multiple bounds, if the read can hit the bounding box of the input mesh, we set it valid read. And yeah, so given each location, the total number of the valid read for the positive and negative side phase, and we set it the NP positive and NP negative. And then we use the max number of the valid read over all the samples divided by the total number of samples to indicate if phase is visible. And typically we set the threshold as 0.5. If the threshold is larger than 0.5, we think this is visible. And we further compute the probability that phase is consistent oriented. And if the front side has more valid read, which means the phase orientation is close to next one, which means there is a large chance, sorry, I should try myself. Yeah, so, yeah, okay, so for the orientation, we most think the front, the read should from side have more visibility read than the negative side of that. If the value here and close to 1, we thought is valid. And if the negative 1, we thought is the phase orientation is wrong, and we should flip the phase. And finally, we consider phase of open surface. It have visibility from both have similar value here. And here for the last term in here, we just want to penalize the phase which is invisible. And once we have these three visual metrics, and we will have our pipeline like this. So first giving input mesh, and we are going to reorient the phase based on our orientation metrics. And then we will add some offset to the phase to make it to close thin volume. And after that, we can follow the previous volume measure to partition the ambient space, then we're solving a graph car problem, extract the interface. And then we further to simplify the math to reduce the number of the phases. Okay, so for the first step, the orientation adjustment. So first, we do not determine the phase orientation by a single phase because it will give a large error issue. And in order to that, so to increase the robustness, we flip the phase based on patch. And we first group the phase based on the connectivity and consistent orientation into a patch. And then we can compute the orientation, we can compute the weighted average orientation measured, and based on that, we can flip all the phase we thought this as wrong orientation. As the next step, we offset the vertex on the patch along the negative normal direction with the user-defined distance to create a thin volumetric shell. And this step is very important because we use the graph car to solving using graph car in volume measure to find the watertight mesh. And if without of that, which means we can only select the candidate phase from the existing candidate phase from ambient ambient space, and which may not lead to a very tight surface. As the example shown on the right, this is with offset, we introduce a lot of unnecessary volume. And then we follow the volume measure to partition the ambient space. And in order to preserving the surface attribution, such as the UV coordinate and material ID, we need to maintain a mapping between the input mesh and the partition mesh. To perform the global graph card, we first classify the phase into 3 groups: the visible, invisible, and actual phase, based on the visibility measure. And here we can show the left is our input phase, and the right we partition the space, and we set the visible phase as green, invisible phase as red, and also the other phase as the actual phase. And then in our graph card, we're solving for self-label to produce the interface mesh that's maximized using the visible phase, while we minimize using the actual phase. And we formulate it as a minimal cutting problem. And the first term D here is penalize the incorrectly or oriented phase. And the second term S here penalize the use of actual phase. So although our global method seems as pre-work can guarantee the watertight output, but it can also produce remaining redundant small phase during we do the space partition actual surface. And so as a last step, we detect the geometry and the UV boundary from the input mesh, and then we keep tracking them during the entire pipeline. And then we can do a constraint triangulation as a last step to reduce all the redundant phase to reduce the size of the mesh. All right, so I want to show some results. So here is the bench, example from ShipNet, which have a lot of narrow phase. And we render this mesh the front with the gray and the back as black. As we can see for the implement, there are a lot of phase already flipped it. And because this reason, and the polymander and the tile well, they cannot determine which is the right volume that we want to preserve. This is why they're losing a lot of upper part. And the alpha warping will merge all the scene frame together, which also not good. And we can see the volume measure definitely produce a much better result than other method, but still they can introduce some unnecessary volume as I highlight here. And in contrast, our method can generate the mesh with watertight manifold and with minimal modifications. And here another example with basket with a lot of flowers. And the main challenge for the example is all the flowers actually a single side phase, and which will create a lot of problem for the polymander tidal weld. And also for same reason, the volume measure, they will create a lot of unnecessary volume. But because we use added some volume offset to create the thin shell for the single phase, will generate the bucket with as a watertight mesh. And we test our method on 500 model from ShipNet, and here is statistic. And our method is very robust and can make the input mesh into the watertight and manifold mesh with 100% success rate. And for the phase side, thanks to our constraint maximization, our output mesh have fewer mesh even than the input mesh. We further use 3 metrics: hot off distance, light speed distance, and PSNR to evaluate how well our output mesh is close to the input mesh. And our result perform consistently for all these 3 metrics on all existing works. And finally, as we need to track all the input mesh and the boundary information through the entire pipeline, and we also we add offset to introduce more cards during the space partition. So our method is more memory and computation time than volume measure, but still I think is acceptable for our applications. And the combination of recutting and graph card with our method robustly handle complex structure. And our method is designed to respect to the input mesh geometry. And here we do a study on the number of bouncing. On the left, we have the 10 bounds for each read, which allow us to have more ability to explore the visibility for the intermesh. And on the right, we don't have bounds. There's only one primary from each face. And the red face here shows the face is invisible in our definition, but still our method can reproduce the mesh the same as the input mesh. And here is some application of our method. We can see after we repair the mesh, our simplified mesh can preserve better shape than without repair. And here is another application for simulations. On the left, actually, we try to existing work to repair the mesh orientation at first. Then we use a Foley measure to convert to water-time mesh and use it for simulation. But unfortunately, even the combined two CR mixed together, we still will close the engine here, which makes the air flow cannot pass through the engine. And in our repaired result, we can allow the airflow pass through the engine and preserve the inside structures. So to conclude, we present 3 visual mirrors to assess the visibility, orientation, and openness. And then we propose a novel framework for mesh repair that incorporates this mirror into a visual guide object function in the graph card program. So for the limitations, so although the recutting is not the main bottleneck of our pipeline, we still want to explore the advanced retracing techniques like the important sampling or adaptive retracing to get a better recutting efficiency. And also, because we use the recutting to determine the face quality, to determine the visibility of the face, we may not preserve all the invisible interstructures. And here we study on the whole side. On the top, we have the bunny with a small hole on the bottom, and most face in the bunny, they will set as it's only visible from all sides. Our method will repair the mesh as thin shell. But if we make the hole very large, and most bunnies will set an open face, they will solve the mesh as a shell with 2 layers. But we can see for the ear part, because the retracing thing cannot give us very good information of visibility for the ear, we may lose the information there. All right, so I'm happy to take questions.
We have time for questions. There is a question, please.
Yeah, so I know that a lot of assets for games and things like that often consist of multiple connected components. Like a car might have a connected component for the body, and the wheels, and maybe even the doors might be separate components. Mm-hmm. I can't quite reason about what would happen if you run this method on such an asset. Would it actually end up fusing all the components together into one manifold mesh? Would it preserve them as separate components? Can you help me with the intuition there? What would happen?
Yeah. So for the question, if you have a model that multiple disconnect components, we will keep it separate. And if we have the model have multiple components, they may have intersection. We will merge them together into one watertight mesh.
Okay. So if the components are already distinctly separated, they'll stay separated.
Yeah. I think they're very typical that when the artists do the modeling, they just make a few pieces and they move them together.
Right.
They don't care how to connect it. And we will merge them together into one surface.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question.
Thank you for the nice talk. I've just a curiosity. You say that when you detect that some faces are on the boundary, you may choose to let the user choose a thickness value to thicken these features. But this thickened feature can intersect other parts of the input. How can you guarantee that this thickening does not introduce other errors in the mesh?
Okay, thanks for the question. Yeah, so they're very good questions. And so once we offset the shell, when offset the single phase of the shell, and we don't care if they intersect with other parts. But after we get all the candidate mesh into our space partition. Then we solving a global option to extract the surface from that. So after we extract the surface, then we have no intersection issue after that.
Okay, so you do that in advance and then you
Yeah.
create the partition. Okay,
Yeah, so
okay.
we at the shell just make the more candidates that we can extract from the ending space to make the sync shell.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Are there other questions? If not, I have one.
Yeah.
So, at the end, do you guarantee that the output is valid, namely without any self-intersection?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we only guarantee the output mesh in the ratio number. But once we convert that to the flow number we use in the application, then we might have some very minor intersection issue at a similar point. And this is the issue that.
So, do you resort to exact arithmetic or like sophisticated arithmetic to compute the coordinates of the newly introduced vertices, or do you using just standard floating-point arithmetic?
So over the entire computation of our pipeline, we don't use any floating number. But once we do all the computation, we have to output the math to a format that can be used in other applications. But during this conversion, and we have to convert the ratio number to a floating number. And during this cross conversion, we might introduce the issue.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think this we have the same issue from work. We cannot guarantee that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
That's a good question. Yeah, actually, I have to ask my manager if we always consider to release code for the better and evaluation for the community, but it will based on our company. Yeah, it's still under evaluation on our law department. Yeah.
And in fact, sharing the data set also would be very good.
Yeah, our data set can be found in our paper. They will link to the data set
There's a
we
link
test.
to the data set.
Yeah, we have all the input data and output data.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
No more questions? Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Okay, so this is about the SGP Test of Time Award. Each year SGP is presenting one award to a paper that's been published at SGP at least 10 years ago. And we slightly adjusted the system. Let me just quickly tell you what the system is. We pick 4 papers based on the age index as computed by Google Scholar. And then we have the SGP steering board and the 2 PC chairs select more papers. So each member of the steering committee and the 2 PC chairs can each add 1 paper to the list. And you see this year we had a list of 5 candidates. And this list of 5 candidates is now voted on by the papers committee. Yeah, so the papers committee can vote on these 5 candidates. I hope you can read this. Yeah, maybe. So there was some criticism in the past for 2 things. Number one, I or Daniele would run this survey, and we would see how people voted. And some people felt uncomfortable that we would see their vote, which I understand. And the other criticism was that every PC member had to select a single paper. And then we would take the paper that had the most votes, and it's kind of well known that this is a bad system to gather a majority opinion. So we switched to a better voting system that's also blind, and now we had the papers committee vote last week, and now because I couldn't see the intermediate results because of this added protection. All I will do now is end the poll, and then, then I hope we can see the result. Yes, the first time. Oh no, it asked. View the poll results. Oh. Okay, so the Test of Time Award 24 goes to Laplacian surface editing by Olga Sorkin and a number of coworkers. Yeah, that you can that's it. And one more thing. We typically have the Test of Time Award winners present their work in the year after. So this time it will be Olga or one of her co-workers. Like a year ago when it was Olga or one of her co-workers. But this year, so last year, it was no free lunch. Max Wardetsky's work on showing that there is no perfect Laplace-Beltrami operator for triangle meshes, but apparently he was not interested in presenting.